This is lecture number 22, based on chapter 35 in the 2015 edition of the book ABCs of Communism. My name's Jason Smith. We're talking about the fight for communism in Peru now. You'll recall that in the last lecture, the last couple of lectures, we were talking about Bolivia. And I mentioned at the time that it's the core culture area for the Central Andes consists of all of Bolivia and the central part of the contemporary country of Peru. And this Central Andean culture area, on the other hand, is much larger. It starts in the north from Venezuela and Colombia and Andes and extends down through Ecuador, then through Peru and Bolivia, through Chile. And from the east-west direction, it goes from the Pacific Ocean all the way to the Brazilian Amazon basin. Now, the core of the Central Andean culture area, as I say, we take the archaeological sequence established by Richard S. McNeish and Associates in the Ayacucho Valley as the anchor sequence for that entire Central Andean cultural core. And I've gone over that with you several times, beginning in the lecture on Venezuela, and we went through it a little bit again in Bolivia. We're going to talk about it every time that we get into the Andes, because it is the core sequence. Now, the beginning of primitive communism, which is to say the beginning of the occupation of the Andes, including the Central Andes, goes at least to 22,000 years ago, based on radiocarbon dates from the Piqui Cave, which is about a 20-minute drive out of Ayacucho. In Chile, as I have mentioned before, there are even earlier dates to 33,000 years on sites down there that are in the coastal region, or at least closer to the coast. And it might have taken 11,000 years for people to get as high as Ayacucho, but I kind of doubt it, which makes me think that in the long run we're going to have much earlier dates in that Ayacucho basin, but this is quite sufficient for the moment. We know that by at least 33,000 years ago, humans had gone all the way to the tip of South America, and by 22,000 years ago they were hunting and gathering in the highest regions of the Andes, which is what the Ayacucho basin is for practical purposes. It's not the highest altitude in the Andes, but it's certainly one of the highest places where you have human habitation. We just went through the fact that tribal agriculture emerged early on, by 10,000 years ago, in this Central Andean core region, and it gradually got to be more important and became the only staple base for the emergence of chiefdoms, both the simple chiefdoms and the advanced theocratic chiefdoms. With the arrival of maize from Mexico, and we know that it is maize because it's now been demonstrated that it's, we know it's Mexican, because the genetic nature of the corn in the archaeological sites in Peru and that from Tehuacan Valley of Mexico is identical, and that cannot happen by independent invention. So that tells us that by 3,000 years ago at least, we have substantial contact between Mesoamerica and the Central Andes. So that just kind of repeats what I've already talked to you about several times as we've talked about the neighboring countries. All right, you saw last time that three big kingdoms emerged around Lake Titicaca, La Paz, and the northern part of Bolivia in the last few hundred years prior to the emergence of the First Empire, which is called Wari. The capital city for the Wari is also very close to Ayacucho. And those of you who have read my book, The Shining Path, The Peruvian Revolution, will know that we actually were involved in some early excavations there at Wari, as well as in Piqui Cave, which gave me a basis upon which to do some training for the guerrilla forces that were operating at that time. I'm not going to go through that either. If you're interested, you can read that book. The important thing is that Wari was the first of the Transandean empires. These are slave-based empires, of course, just like the kingdoms that they had absorbed. Slave-based in the sense that large numbers of people were enslaved working in agricultural fields. That doesn't mean everybody in the society was a slave, but what it does mean is that the common denominator, for the lowest common denominator for wages, is whatever has to be paid to keep the slave alive. And that means that's what the non-slave farmers were competing against. As in the U.S. Itself, during the Civil War and prior to the Civil War, this meant that in the U.S., the poor whites were hardly any better off than the black slaves because they had to compete constantly with slave labor. All right. The Warrior Empire fell apart as a consequence of internal warfare, which we won't go into here because it's not really that relevant. A several hundred-year interregnum occurs, and another city-state based out of Cuzco, which most of you have heard of because it's a major tourist destination these days. There was a city-state in Cuzco which reconstructed the Warrior Empire, and now we call it the Inca Empire, which can be I-N-K-A or I-N-C-A depending upon who's writing it. If you're drinking Inca Cola, it would be I-N-K-A. One of the worst soft drinks I think I could imagine drinking up until I drank it for about 3 years inside a Peruvian prison. But at any rate, let's go back to the point where the Spanish first made contact with the Inca civilization. Now, this is 1532, and what's happened is that a Spanish adventurer, actually two of them brothers, the Pizarro brothers, the one we talk about the most is named Francisco Pizarro, put together an investor group, exactly as Cortez had done before he went to Mexico, and made a couple of forays. They put together a couple of groups out of Panama, made a couple of forays down toward the Peruvian coast because of rumors that had reached them in Panama about another empire as big as that of the Aztecs. So in 1532 they finally got down there. Now the part of Peru that they landed in is what is actually now pretty much the border of Ecuador and Peru, the contemporary countries. But from there, Pizarro has, as Cortez had before him, about 200 investors. These are guys who can afford to buy their own armor and their guns and their horses, whatever retainers they think they're going to need with them to maintain this sort of thing, and still pay Pizarro a fee to be part of this conquest of Peru adventure. They marched up to a town in the highlands called Cajamarca, and there they met with the king of the emperor of the Inca Empire named Atahualpa. Atahualpa had just won a civil war in his empire and defeated his brother, whose capital was in Quito, what's today Quito, Ecuador. So he was coming back with an army of a couple 100,000 men, with 80,000 of which he had personal command of. So when he heard about these Spaniards coming up to visit, it was more like they were tourists, of no interest to them in any way other than the fact that they were a new kind of tourist that they hadn't seen before. And this meant that Atahualpa would not take the Spanish seriously, which was perfect. It was much the same, as you'll recall, as Montezuma had not taken the Spanish too seriously until they started marching on Mexico City, and then he kept a close eye on them. Well, Atahualpa didn't even have that period of time to get used to Pizarro. All of a sudden he shows up at Cajamarca in 1532. Atahualpa does not take this little fly-sized Spanish force as anything more than a bothersome fly, but he's kind of interested in it. And so he makes the mistake of letting the Spaniards get into the position on the first night they're there when they kidnap him. They ambush him, they kidnap him, they attack and kill thousands of his followers who are not anticipating anything happening to them that night. Now, the first reaction of Atahualpa is to offer to pay ransom to Pizarro. Normally that would work when a very wealthy person was captured. in the Inca Empire. But in this particular case, these Spaniards were in for the strike. They weren't interested in just ransom. They knew they were going to steal everything that Atahualpa had, but they wanted a lot more than that. They wanted the whole empire. They wanted to do there exactly what Cortés and his band of Ronin had done when they got into what they now call New Spain. So, in November 1533, the Spaniards had gotten as far as Cuzco. That's the capital city of the Atahualpa's capital city, and now they killed him. Took a room full of gold and a room full of silver. I'm not sure what the exact size of those rooms were, but it was everything that the Incas could get together as a ransom. The Spaniards, of course, took it, and then they killed Atahualpa anyway. Well, the Inca now realized what a series of mistakes they had made and how much trouble they were in. But what they did was to stall and retreat, and they went back into the mountains, and it took the Spaniards 40 years to confront the main Inca armies and defeat them. Now, that's a much longer time than it had taken in Mexico. Of course, one of the reasons is that the Andean geography is much more complex and much more difficult. First of all, you have the fact that these are Spaniards and they're not used to such high altitudes. And the other part of it is that you have to go up and down mountains to get anywhere. It's about this time that Machu Picchu, the big tourist attraction today, it was built. And the Spaniards didn't even find that at all. It wasn't found until around 1911, a little over 100 years ago. So the Central Andes were never really conquered the way New Spain was conquered. Now, the Spaniards did set up latifundias here and there, and of course they enslaved the Indians to work in silver mines and gold mines. But you want to remember this, that only 2% of the entire nation of Peru is arable land. The rest of it is coastal desert or very steep, high mountainsides, so that are not, that you can't put under irrigation no matter how many little rock fences and irrigation ditches you build. So you have about 2% of the country. That 2% of the country, of course, the Spaniards grabbed for themselves and set up latifundias, but that was here and there in the valleys like Ayacucho Valley, the valley in Huancayo. For those of you who have maps, you want to take a look at it, you can, or you can see it in the book. The important thing here is that at no time did the Spanish, in whatever form, either as Ronin or as independent latifundistas or as Spanish crown, have anything more political control over the Central Andes than they could exercise from a port city like Lima and Callao, or from or Trujillo, or a mountain town like Arequipa. That's about it. The further you get away from these towns, the less likely there is to be any central government control for 400 years. That's the way this whole thing boiled out. Now, in the early 1500s, say 1542, two things happened. The Spanish crown institutionalized the system that the Ronin had created in the Caribbean and New Spain, what they called new laws for the Indies. The same year, they created what they called the Viceroyalty of Peru, which included all of Spanish South America and Panama, except for what is now Venezuela. Now, the first Spanish viceroy to come into Peru attempted to enforce those laws, and he came in 1544. Within 2 years, he was killed by the latifundistas, who didn't want anything to do with this crown rule. These are true Creoles in an early revolt. That is, these are Spaniards who either are part of the original conquest or are the sons and daughters of those that came from the original conquest and grabbed some of this land and built latifundias for themselves and enslaved the local Indians. And they don't want any bullshit from Spain about how they're running their country. And furthermore, they don't have to put up with it. They've got their own men under arms, the same ones they're using to control the Indians. All they have to do is get a couple of families together. So they get rid of this viceroy in Spain, and in Madrid they're beginning to realize that what they're dealing with in Peru is quite different than what they're dealing with in New Spain, and so they adapt. And one of the things they let happen is they let the latifundistas begin to run things locally, and the peninsular Spaniards, that is those from Spain, they kind of stick around Lima and their little estates there, their fancy houses and so on, and let the Creole and mestizos run a hierarchy over the slaves out there in the countryside, and the miners who are running the mines. See, only Indians can work in these mines because Indians have, the high Andes have a better kind of hemoglobin for picking up oxygen, picks up a lot more. Plus, barrel chest, but much bigger lung capacity. So they can work where a white man or a black man cannot in the high altitudes of, say, 14,000 feet in these mines in the high Andes. So you can begin to see that what is taking place in Peru is, in a way, it's identical to what happened in Mexico, but in another way, when you get down to the details of it, it's quite different. Now, there were revolts from time to time of Indians who were either pissed off of the way they were being treated by their Spanish overseers, or in the mines or on the land, would revolt. We have a couple of revolts named after a man named Tupac Amaru, and which you may have heard of because it's become a popular name among a certain group of North American rappers and that sort of thing. But at any rate, he managed to get together about 60,000 Indians into an army and attacked Spanish rule. One of the key places he liked to attack was the Spanish town of Ayacucho, which is where a lot of our discussion here about Peru is going to take place, because it's where the most recent rebellion against capitalism occurred under the leadership of the Communist Party of Peru, shining path of Carlos Mariátegui, which we are going to get to in a few minutes. But at any rate, Tupac Amaru liked to attack the Spanish in Ayacucho. Why? Well, the Spanish built Ayacucho primarily to block the only land route that you could realistically use to get to Lima. So if an Inca general, a revolting general like this one in 1780, decided that he was going to win against the Spanish, he'd have to go down and push them out of Lima and Callao, and to do that he'd have to go through Ayacucho. So Ayacucho becomes an important place, more so than it appears on the map when you're just looking at a map of Peru, because what you don't usually see there is the mountain connections. But from Ayacucho you would go through a narrow area all the way to the town of Huancayo, and then you go over the Andes in one of the lowest, it's not all that low, I've driven over there and I can tell you that when you get to 14,000 feet you've got to stop your car and adjust your carburetor and so on and so forth. But relatively speaking, it's better than 22,000 feet north and south. So it is a way down to the coast. Now, going up to 1789, which brings us up to the French Revolution and the appearance of Napoleon Bonaparte, Spain had not changed very much at all, nor had Spanish America. But what happened in 1789 with the French Revolution unleashed not everything, I'm not going to go over everything it unleashed in Europe, but what it did do was to bring capitalism and a bourgeois form of government called Napoleonic Code to Europe. And now, when Napoleon decides to remove the Spanish monarchy altogether and put his brother on the throne, it brings it all to the Spanish America as well, because almost overnight, most of Spain, except for that down in the corner where you have Cadiz, has fallen into the hands of the Bonapartists. And that means all of Spanish America has now fallen into the hands of the Bonapartists, or at least that's what they want it to mean. Now, there is a division in Spain between those that are loyal to the old monarchy and are allied with the British down there in Cadiz and are pushing their way forward, as you see in that series Sharp's Rifles, if you ever get a chance to watch that television series. I can't remember who does that, A&E, or at any rate, it's a pretty good series. Also, some of the Latin Americans who like de San Martin from Argentina, for whatever reason, get to Cadiz and they join up with the Spanish loyalists, and they meet the British in the course of this, and they learn a lot about what warfare is really all about, as far as if you consider Britain to be the epitome of modern warfare in 1809, then they're getting that kind of an education. So, the important part about this to us is that in Peru, for our discussion of Peru, you have a division of Peru also where most of the Peruvian ruling class have never really had much use for the Spanish crown. And most all of them are Creoles, that is, they're Spaniards, but they've been born in Peru. They have no intention of going to Spain. Maybe they might send their kids there or someplace in Europe when it comes time to go to college, but for most of them, they have no desire to go back there. So a lot of them are probably concerned about what their legal status might be, because they're always involved in things which are illegal as far as the Spanish crown is concerned. So we have a division of the Peruvians in Peru between those who are sympathetic to the peninsulars, that is, the Spaniards that are from Spain, born in Spain, and those who are not. In 1820, the Argentine José de San Martin, who I mentioned to you because he had fought with the loyalist forces in Chile, in Spain, and met the British that way, has returned to Argentina, quickly taking command of the local Creole forces that are fighting against Spain there, expelled Spain from Argentina, crossed the mountains, given the necessary assistance to Bernardo O'Higgins, who was fighting the Spaniards in Chile, and he defeats them. In 1821, San Martin's forces entered Lima, which had by now been abandoned by Spanish troops. The last Spanish troops have gone up to Ayacucho, and there they're going to fight against San Martin and Simón Bolívar in 1822 under the Venezuelan general Sucre, in the Battle of Junín in August 1824, and the Battle of Ayacucho on December 9th, 1824. Sucre wipes out the last of the Spanish army up there. He then takes a city and names it after himself, and the country is named after Simón Bolívar in Bolivia. Now everything's, but in Lima, which is the capital of the old viceroyalty, everything now falls into the hands of the revolutionaries, and this is the end of Spanish dominance in Peru. Now, after all of this Bolivar Sucre business and so on, a man named Andrés Santa Cruz comes to power. Is replaced by another named José de la Mar, who was in turn supplanted by Agustín Gamarra in 1829, and he lasted until 1833. These names aren't important to you. I only mention it because when I was reading this prior to this lecture, to refamiliarize myself with these details, I had to start laughing at this Agustín Gamarra president from 1829 to 1833, because the only Gamarra I ever knew in Peru was one we call trapo sucio, which is Spanish for dirty rag, and that was in this prison in Lurigancho. This was a different prison than you probably are familiar with, but it was very much like what you see in Mel Gibson's movie called Get the Gringo, which was released in 2012. Excellent. Shows you kind of what... At any rate, in these kinds of prisons, if you have civilian clothes, you can wear them. Now, until we arrived, this wasn't really much of an issue in Lurigancho, because the only civilian clothes these guys had, these are the most dispossessed and most oppressed of the street rats of all of Lima have been thrown into this place, and they don't have any clothes except for the rags that they were wearing in the streets, so it never was much of an issue. When we showed up, we started wearing three-piece suits and cowboy boots and things like that, and I remember sitting at a table in a pinstripe navy blue suit, listening to Gomorrah, sitting over there in one of his raggedy outfits as usual. This guy always looked like a dirty rag. If he ever took a bath, I don't know when it was, but he performed a certain function for me, so that I would have to talk to him every day or two, bring him up to my office, and we'd have a conversation. But anyway, that's neither here nor there, except not everybody named Gomorrah is destined to be a president of Peru. Well, Spain doesn't really come into the picture with regard to these Creoles again until around 1864. Now, at this time, we have these islands off the shore, especially around the Atacama Desert, the northern part of Peru, which are full of guano. And guano is not just bat droppings, it's largely bird droppings. The important thing is it's got a lot of potassium nitrate in it. And potassium nitrate is useful for all kinds of fertilizer purposes and for armaments, of course, for gunpowder. Well, in 1864, these deposits involved Peruvian capitalists in a war with Spanish capitalists. Now, the latter had seized the guano-rich Chincha Islands, and the capitalist governments in Ecuador, Bolivia, and Chile came to the assistance of their brethren in Peru, defeating the Spanish forces in 1866. The resulting Treaty of 1879 was the first formal Spanish recognition of Peruvian sovereignty. Now, in 1873, they begin to see a falling out among themselves because Peru signed a secret defensive alliance with its capitalist allies in Bolivia. That is, the businessmen of Peru that are running the country there have made an alliance with their fellow businessmen in Bolivia to defend Bolivia's nitrate interest against the increasingly powerful Chilean businessmen. When a quarrel arose between Chile and Bolivia over the Atacama nitrate fields along the disputed borders of the two nations, Peru was then drawn into the War of the Pacific, and they were fighting this time against Chile on the side of their ally Bolivia. Well, Chile had a navy now, and it was strong enough that they were able to defeat Lima. And under the Treaty of Ancón in 1884, Peru's nitrate province of Tarapacá was awarded to Chile. Ancón, a few miles north of Lima, is today a popular resort for Lima's ruling class folk. Whenever I think of Ancón, which is, like they say, about 20 miles north of Lima on the ocean, this is where Lima's ruling class likes to go to have a weekend vacation, or even a summer vacation. I knew a fellow who escaped from an island prison, a guy named Hector, who I got involved with, we might talk about later on. Anyway, he was proud of the fact that he had escaped from a whole bunch of different Peruvian prisons. And he came to see me one day when the Billy Hayes movie about this guy escaping from prison in Turkey was in the theaters downtown in Lima, and wanted me to write a book about his escapes from all of these different prisons, because he thought this guy Billy Hayes is nothing. Look at what I've done. He told me about, he escaped from this island prison where by building a raft and putting bottles and things under it, and I don't remember all the details, but anyhow, nobody had ever made it successfully before, so it was kind of like an escape from Alcatraz. Got out of there, and the tide carried him in, and he finally came up on the beach at Ancón. I thought, man, for all of those ruling class people out there getting their sun at Ancón, this must have been quite a shock to see this hoodlum coming up on a raft there at Ancón. But that's neither here nor there. At any rate, the Ancón Treaty of 1884 gave the nitrate provinces to the Chileans. Well, in 1929, this whole business came up again because there was supposed to be an election that would decide whether Chile was going to keep Arica and Peru regain Tacna. Eventually that's what did happen, but the Bolivians were permanently cut out of having any. They had lost their Pacific coastline altogether, which was a couple hundred miles, and they needed it. Okay, that brings us up to the part we've talked about just briefly, and that is Jose Carlos Mariátegui. I mentioned last time, I'm going to do it again because this is really important. Borodin arrives in Mexico in 1919. In October, I believe it is, the Communist Party of Mexico is formed, and he leaves just before Christmas to head back to Russia by way of Cuba. Now, the Mexicans have selected a man named Jose Allen to be the boss of their party, and he has taken the job of St. Paul, so to speak. If you want to have a comparison with the spread of Christianity, Jose Allen has really taken the... Borodin must have given him quite a talking to, because he, for the rest of his life, devotes every waking minute that he's not organizing workers in the Mexican oil field. He dedicates to kicking off communist parties. Now, it isn't too hard, because the word has spread throughout the left intellectual community in Latin America of Borodin's arrival, of his instructions, of if you want to get to be part of this Leninist Comintern, get to Mexico City, because they have the authority to authorize you. So people are coming from every major city in Latin America, intellectuals, young people. As soon as they get out of high school or college, they're heading for Mexico City to talk to Jose Allen about becoming communists affiliated with the Comintern. One of these was a guy named Jose Carlos Mariátegui, who arrives immediately after Borodin leaves in 1920. And he talks to Jose Allen, who tells him, yes, absolutely, we're going to submit your application to join the Communist Party and Comintern-wise, and we will submit the application of your party to become a officially recognized party. Well, of course, there wasn't any party yet, but Mariátegui convinced him that he could do it. But he was honest with him and told him, he needs to know more about Leninism. And Allen said, well, that's a really good attitude, because you do need to know more about Leninism. And he said, so I want you to go right now to Italy. So he wasn't in Mexico City very long. My guess is a few weeks, at the most a month or 6 weeks, before they had him on a ship heading to Livorno. Now, in 1921, the Italian Communist Party is having its founding conference in Livorno, its founding convention. And coming to that are some of the luminaries of the Comintern from Moscow, because they have great hopes. They've spent a lot of money getting this Italian venture started. Some of it wasn't spent very well. When Lenin was sending guys all over the world, he sent one guy to Italy who just stole all his money, for example. So the things didn't always work out as well as they had with Borodin, which is my point. Now, Mariátegui gets to Livorno, and he is immediately involved with the local Italians who have been designated to form a party in the following year, and he meets a girl and he marries her. When he comes back to Lima, he says, well, I did two things. I learned some Marxism-Leninism, and I got a wife while I was in Italy. So I can understand both of those things, because those were my teenage years too, even though I was in Army intelligence. I was reminded the other day when I got a call from a woman I hadn't seen for 50 years that I was 17 when I was there, and she was working on the base, and she was 21. And I remembered, that's right, I was still 17 when I got there, even though I was in military intelligence. So I kind of feel a kinship with Mariátegui, because I was roughly the same age as he was coming in there, and so many of his impressions I think I must have shared, even though it was, of course, many years later. Now, you might also remember that it's at this time that Mussolini is breaking out with he used to be part of this Second International Socialist bunch, but they were always so broad that they could include all kinds of people. This is why Lenin said we have to have a third international, so we can have people that are in the right way to begin with. And that's Mussolini is getting ready for his march on Rome, but the important thing for our purposes is that Moriarty is there for that meeting. He's fully indoctrinated in what the Comintern wants done in the New World as well as in the Old, and he heads back to Peru. Now, while he was gone, there were big developments that were going on inside Peru itself. One of them was that the oligarchy in Peru was shrinking. You now had about 12 families who owned the entire country, and they were picking up. When you have that kind of money, of course, it's not that hard to pick up all of the property and everything else you want all around you. This was forcing out many middle-sized business people who couldn't possibly compete with these giants. This is what we call the petty bourgeoisie. Out of that came a man named Victor Raúl Aya de la Torre. In 1924, he came to Mexico City, but the Comintern wasn't interested in him because he wasn't willing to submit to Lenin's 21 points, and they wouldn't have wanted him anyway because he was way too much of an obvious right-wing opportunist of the Gompers type AFL in the USA. And he formed a group instead called APRA, A-P-R-A, and we're going to talk about that a little bit down here. By the time that Moriarty had gotten back to Lima and Aya de la Torre had formed his group up in Mexico City, which was a Peruvian group, but he'd had to form it up there because he'd been chased out of the country by the oligarchy's military dictatorship. When Moriarty gets back, he writes 7 essays, which we're going to talk about a little bit later on, and these become a cornerstone of Latin American communism in terms of the first theoretical documents which are written by South America or Latin American that are truly independent and regardless of their validity, they have given all kinds of Latin Americans new insights into their own history, much the same way as I'm trying to do here. And there are also new insights into what might be possible in terms of bringing communism to Peru and other parts of Latin America. And in addition to that, Moriarty realizes that by 1928 that I've got to make a definitive split with Aya de la Torre, who's making some progress, because these petty bourgeois politicians, they're pissed off because they've been squeezed and they've lost their property and their businesses and so on, but they know that there's only a few of them. If they're going to go anywhere, they're going to have to ally with farmers, that is the poor ones, the poorest farmers and the poorest industrial workers, so they've got some shock troops to throw against the oligarchy. And for that, the opera has been flirting with the Moriarty and his Peruvian communists, and in 1928 Moriarty makes a final split with them. Okay, I think I told you last time, and I'll tell you again, that 1979-1980 campaign in Peru for the Constituent Assembly featured a lot of famous Peruvians running for office legally for the first time. Now that's because the U.S. imposed Morales Bermudez dictatorship that had assassinated President Velasco, put this drunken, drug-addicted fool into office. This is the guy that used to get on TV when I was there, and he'd be drunk as a skunk, drinking pisco and snorting coke over here, all on television, and everybody that worked for the government was required to watch this. I doubt whether they really did, but he'd be on as long as he could stay sober until he passed out. It could be several hours. So, and he would just kind of ramble. That was the guy they wanted to replace. So they decided to put a little bit prettier face on all of this. Two of the characters that were running were Aya de la Torre. He came out to visit us in Lurigancho. because there were a number of important people there by this time. I wasn't the only high-profile prisoner. And another guy named Hugo Blanco, who had started a guerrilla war and never been captured, and he had done some damage to the government up in a part of Peru with his guerrilla fighters, and I had a respect for him for that reason, although he was a Trotskyist. And I had, I think I mentioned to you before, I'll mention again, I had a question. I didn't say anything to Aya de la Torre, I just listened. My right-hand man inside the prison there was an engineer who was the son of a medical doctor who had, his whole family had been a priestess all their lives, and they were from Trujillo. And I knew that I'd already heard everything I wanted to know about Aya de la Torre. So, but I didn't know Hugo Blanco, and I had a question for him, which was, there is some talk among Peruvian Trotskyists that Mariátegui would have joined with them had he lived past 1931, whatever it was. And he said, quote, there was no evidence that he was aware of to support the idea that Mariátegui was ever anything other than a Stalinist, unquote. That's his term. Stalinist is what Trotskyists called people that followed the official Soviet line. At any rate, he did say he agreed with Mariátegui's 7 essays, but then all Latin American Marxists say that, so that doesn't really mean anything. But what it did was to convince me that what I had already decided must have been the case was the case, and that is, there was never any reason to believe that José Carlos Mariátegui was ever anything than a José Allen, Communist Party of Mexico, Foreign Bureau kind of communist who went to Italy, got fully indoctrinated in the Soviet position there at the Livorno Conference of the founding of the PCI, Communist Party of Italy, got a wife that believed the same way he did, and they returned to Lima. Eudosio Ravines had come in 1929 to see him in Lima, and he wanted him to send representatives to 2 meetings, a founding first convention in Latin America for the Comintern of Latin American Communist parties, and another founding convention in Montevideo, Uruguay, for a Red International of Trade Unions, both of which happened. Unfortunately, Mariátegui couldn't go, but he picked 2 men who did go. Both men would be important later on. Mariátegui died in April, complications of his osteomyelitis, and in May the Communist Party was formed and voted into the Comintern officially in Peru. Now, the Peruvian Communist Party went through a whole series of stages that I don't know that we're going to bother with in this particular lecture because it's all in your book. But it follows the typical pattern, and that is that up until the beginning of until the summer of 1941, the Communist Party was a typically militant Leninist party in the unions, in the mines and in the factories in Lima, Trujillo, and Arequipa, which were the only 3 urban centers really of any significance, and it's stretching it to call Arequipa an urban center. Lima and Trujillo at least were. And everything changed after the Soviet Union was attacked, because all of a sudden the Peruvian Communist Party, like every other Latin American Communist Party, fell into line with the Soviet position, which was the important contradiction in the world now is between the Soviet Union and those who are attacking us on our western frontier and might attack us on our eastern frontier. Fascism, in other words. And our allies are the English-speaking countries, which are primarily the United Kingdom, the United States and Canada, Australia and New Zealand, and we don't want to have any kind of strikes in companies that are supplying these countries with any kind of material that's important to the war. So all of a sudden, they go from being the most militant pro-strike party to being no strikes at all. Now, what that did was put Communist Party growth in the unions in the mountains of Peru, as well as those we talked about before in Bolivia, into a difficult position because it's hard line to sell to these Indian miners that, well, your hours, wages, and working conditions are atrocious, but that's tough shit. You're going to have to wait 3 or 4 years while we win this other war over here with Russia. Well, most of them don't even know where Russia is. Could care less. So you can see that this is not an easy line to sell. But they managed to hold on to the skeleton of their organization through these war years. Now, what happened rapidly thereafter was the same thing happened all over the world. That is, as soon as the red flag flew over the bombed-out Reichstag building in Berlin, the Truman Gang had consolidated their power over the U.S. government, which is the same as saying the Meyer-Lansky Gang. And their policy toward the Soviet Union was entirely different. They wanted to go with the war with the Soviet Union as soon as possible, and immediately they knew they could go to war with the communist parties and the progressive governments of Latin America, which should be done anyway for its own reasons. And so Peru, of course, fell right into that, and we're going to see what that meant in practice. Well, as far as the capitalists are concerned, it meant the growth of 2 huge monopolies, Grace Shipping Lines, Grace Banking, Grace, a group of companies which became HSBC, Hong Kong Shanghai Bank. The other one is this rubber company, which committed perhaps the greatest atrocities in the history of the capitalist world, certainly in the New World, up until the beginning of World War I, when they had murdered at least 60,000 Indians up in the Amazonian region of northeastern Peru. We'll get to that later on. But in the meantime, the Sino-Soviet split begins to have a manifestation in Peru. And that is, but all of these things are happening in the capitalist world are now being confronted by the Peruvian communists, but they have 2 different possible directions to go into. One is the Soviet line, which is championed by Nikita Khrushchev and local revisionists, and in essence what they're trying to sell is the line that we can have a peaceful transition to socialism in Peru. The other is a more militant group that is now following Mao Zedong and saying that no, the only way we can have a transition in Peru is by an armed people's war. So, the original Communist Party has now split, and the revisionist PCP is calling itself Peruvian Communist Party Red Flag, or Partido Comunista Peruano Bandera Roja. Now, the rising star intellectual of this group was a young Peruvian professor at the university in Ayacucho. It's called Universidad de San Cristobal de Bomonga. And his name was Abimael Guzman. Guzman traveled to China in the 1970s, and he returned with advice from Communist Party Chairman Mao and other top Chinese leaders of that time, who urged him to start a real Communist Party in Peru and to be self-reliant. I have discussed my conversations with him in Ayacucho, that is with Guzman, when I was leading an archaeological project there in 1977, and I've discussed the details of those conversations for those of you who might be interested in my book, Shining Path of the Peruvian Revolution, which is the 3rd volume in the series of books called Idaho Smith's Search for the Foundation. You could get the printed copies of those books in some libraries. You go to worldcat.org. WorldCat stands for World Catalog.org. Type in my name and you'll see where those Search for the Foundation books are available, and in what libraries and how far they are from you. Or you can get that book's now in 2nd edition, and you can get it in ebook form at Kindle Books at Amazon.com. Enough said about that. Well, Guzman formed his own party out of his following in the PCP Red Flag, and he called it the Partido Comunista del Perú, Sendero Luminoso de Carlos Mariátegui, or PCP SLCM. In the cap press up here, it was frequently called Sendero Luminoso, or Shining Path. But that was its full name, was Communist Party of Peru, Shining Path of Carlos Mariátegui. That last part being tacked on by Guzman to make it clear that he was not part of the now rump PCP, which was calling itself PCP Unidad, or PCP United. It participated in the 1978 elections in a united front party called FOSEP. It did not return to real political life until the rise of Ollanta Humala, when it joined his Peru Wins party in a united front that won electoral success 4 years ago in 2010. Now, the capture of Abimael Guzman finally occurred in 1992. I think most of you know that. And it removed the Senderista party from the Peruvian scene. This is one of the strangest things I've ever seen. What happened to Abimael Guzman? Well, those of you who have read that book, Shining Path, The Peruvian Revolution, know that this Maoist movement almost came to power in Peru. It was, shockingly, it was on the verge of national success when it managed to snatch defeat from the jaws of victory. I've never seen anything quite like it. Coming to a sudden and inglorious, if not ignominious end, with the capture of Abimael Guzman in 1992. Guzman was captured in a safe house in Lima. What happened? Well, one thing stands out, and that was the stupidity of putting your leader in the most dangerous possible location in the pre-final insurrectionary stage. In other words, they were about to launch the last drive, which would have brought Lima and Trujillo and Arequipa into what they had already complete control of the countryside. Can you imagine the Bolsheviks in Russia ever being this stupid? You know, you recall in chapter 13 in this book, and we talked a lot about how they had to always hide Lenin outside of Petrograd, even after the February Revolution, because they knew what would happen if the cops ever captured him. So, or can you imagine that Mao Zedong would be stupid enough to have himself physically next to Chiang Kai-shek? I mean, these guys marched all the way across South China and up the western side of China, all the way to Yan'an to get away from Chiang Kai-shek, find a secure place. So, to me, the whole thing was incomprehensible at the time. Well, I have, therefore, over the years that have followed that, talked to, well, there was a time when I had every narcotics cop in Lima on my payroll, so some of those drug and political cops I have maintained contact with over the subsequent years, if for no other reason than just friendship. And so I've asked questions here and there about how was such a thing possible. Now, I read what the U.S. agents said, that they had been looking at trash cans and they found stuff that they thought led back to Guzman and so on, and I thought, well, I don't think that's going to hold water. I know from personal experience that the DEA-CIA operation was run by a lot of fumble bums. I don't know what the hell they're doing. So, who then could have helped the PIPs, now the SIM, the time the Peruvian Investigating Police, now the National Intelligence Service? Well, I began to get an answer which kind of made sense to me, but you know, these cops that I was talking to down there said, yeah, we got tips, but we knew it wasn't from the gringos because they didn't know what the hell they were doing. We thought it was from disgruntled Senderistas, and it may well have been. But it might also have been, there was one intelligence service that knew the intimate details of what the Senderistas were doing, and that was China's. Now, from the standpoint of the Chinese, in 1992, when Guzman is captured, you recall that this was a long time ago in terms of the relative progress that China has made that we now think of when we think about China. At that time, the Chinese leaders would have thought if we can't convince our own people in places like Peru that what we're doing is the right thing, that we're going to have more serious problems. And on the other hand, if these guys were to disappear, then we wouldn't have to confront this problem at all. I have a suspicion that if and when this final history is ever written, we may find out that there was more to it than a few disgruntled Sandinistas capturing Guzman there in Lima. Well, however that will be, that's another matter altogether. I want to start now on the development of modern capitalism in Peru. And by that I mean when the USA-based capitalists began pushing out other foreign capitalist competitors in Peru in the 1800s, and then allied permanently with the 12 biggest domestic Peruvian capitalist families. In so doing, the 12 families and their U.S. imperialist allies took control of all basic Peruvian industries. There's a comedy called Moon Over Parador, which is well worth your watching, because it's exactly this. You have exactly this kind of a situation with a very small group of capitalist families, in this case led by a secret policeman played by Raul Julia, who is kind of front dictator. Well, there are a lot of stars in this movie, so at any rate, it's almost exactly the same thing in this Moon Over Parador as you have in Peru in the late 1800s. Well, as we've seen in 1821, Peru was financially strapped. The guano trade in 1849, 59, 69, 79, those 30 years saw a reversal. A lot of capital that wanted to flow into Peru precisely to get their hands on that guano. And then from 1821 on, Peru was able to embark on a free trade and an ambitious railroad building program. But railroad building, of course, was plagued with corruption, just the way it was if you watch that movie Hell on Wheels up here when the Union Pacific was building their first transcontinental line. Of course, railroads in the U.S. were always investment projects which were 9 out of 10 times were just scams, but at any rate, the railroad program there was just as heavily plagued by corruption as it was in the U.S. and Europe. And these guys from the U.S. and Europe already knew how to bribe authorities and different aspects of how to use railroads to make money. What they did in all of these cases was always the same pattern. The government gets into financial trouble. They can't pay the bonds that they issued, so somebody will come in and say, we'll settle the bond issue for you in exchange for 50 or 100 years of all of the revenue you get from, say, guano. Well, the guy that's holding these original no-good Peruvian bonds is thinking, right now this isn't worth anything, but this guy can get me 10 cents on a dollar for them, I'll take it, which is about as much as this settlement would have amounted to. The second thing would be that the Peruvians would now be in a position where they would have to give up a huge amount of revenue, say all the revenue from the Guano Islands, all of the revenue from the railroads for the next 100 years comes to us in exchange for us resolving your credit problems. And so in this way they were able to trick the Peruvian government into a situation from which you could never recover, in which they could get their hands legally on all of the most important profit-making centers in Peru. And that's exactly what happened. One American railroad baron named Henry Meigs pulled that whole thing off and built in exactly the way I've just described, got permanent right to all of the revenues for a train that would run from Callao and Lima all the way up into Huancayo across the Andes. And he did that in several stages because he would go as far as he had money to build, and then he'd have to get the Peruvians to issue more bonds, and those bonds would never be paid, so they would have to be settled somewhere down the road in another financial intrigue of one kind or another. So by 1878, Peru was bankrupt.